Geoeconomic warfare in the 21st century. This is an email interview with the Shanghai-based independent economist Andy Siat, originally published in the online edition of Hankook Ilbo or the Korea Times on 4th of January 2022. Slight revisions were made to the original text for your listening pleasure. Start of interview. Question: how is America's geoeconomic warfare against China coming along? Answer: try as it might, the US has no power to contain the rise of China. That's because the US is suffering from too much debt, US social costs are high, and the US is deeply fragmented internally. A more efficient solution is needed. The semiconductor chip export restrictions imposed by the US is slowing China's technology development without hurting the US economy. But this tactic is only shifting the burden of containing China to other countries. If the intention is to encourage China's neighbors to join the US in containing China, it doesn't seem to be working. Question: when push comes to shove, will China pull out the rare earth card on the US? Answer: if the conflict over Taiwan escalates, the US will impose an embargo on China. There is a 100% chance of that happening. In response, China will stop supplying rare earths to the United States. Although the US is sitting on one of the world's largest rare earth deposits right on US soil, they are all exported to China for processing. America is lazy and poor. It couldn't be bothered to process its own rare earth even if it only costs a few $billion to invest. The United States wants to contain China on the cheap, using technology blockade and relying on China's neighbors to do America's bidding. Question: what do you say to critics who point out that economic resources have been weaponized? Answer: the United States and its Western allies fear the power of China. They talk more about fighting the Chinese military than the Russian military. It is indeed a source of global uncertainty. When you come right down to it, this is all about the global hegemony of Western powers, of Western values, and even of Western racial bigotry all thrown into the mix to create an environment that harms trust between nations. The competition will only end when the United States is finally pushed out of Asia, or China finally collapses. Question: what are China's weaknesses and countermeasures? Answer: China relies on imports of high-performance semiconductor chips. This puts a very strong constraint on China. Today, the world's cutting-edge high-performance nanochips are produced using a lithographic printing machine or exposure equipment. This printing machine or equipment is produced by a Dutch equipment maker called ASML. This Dutch company enjoys a virtual monopoly on high-performance nanochip production equipment, and the US has been pressing the Dutch government to cut off business with Chinese companies based on hyped-up security reasons. It will take time for China to clone such machines. Aside from this vulnerability, China is highly dependent on oil imports from the Middle East. To protect itself from US tactic of shock and awe, China plans to build an additional 160 nuclear power plants. Nuclear power could be used to make hydrogen, a transportation fuel. China could also bypass the US blockade in the Persian Gulf by building a pipeline through Afghanistan to Iran. Africa and Mongolia could also replace Australia as a major iron ore import source. Question: how has China adapted so far to the world's increasing uncertainty and volatility? Answer: China's economic strategy is to diversify both its exports and imports. Over the past 3 years, China's exports have increased by 40%. However, restructuring of its imports has been relatively slow. Despite the open hostility of Canberra against Beijing, China still relies heavily on Australian iron ore. We should instead be investing our resources into third world countries to help build technology and supply chain self-reliance. Question: Korea relies heavily on China for its resources. What should Korea do? Answer: Korea does not have the economies of scale to be self-sufficient. If Korea tries to be self-sufficient, it will lose its competitiveness. Instead of focusing on self-sufficiency, Korea needs to diversify its supply lines. However, there is simply no competitor to rival China in terms of processing capacity. For all its flaws, coexisting with China may be the only option for Korea. Down the road, Korea may also sign a free trade agreement or FTA with China. Korea, China, and Japan have been discussing a free trade agreement for a long time, but to no avail. It is not easy given the position and opposition of the United States. End of interview. This text-to-speech audio is brought to you by Hankook Ilbo or the Korea Times and read out by naturalreaders.com. Thank you for listening.